Under the sky of an empire that stretched from the hot sands of the African desert to the cold mists of the British Isles, Rome, the eternal city, pulsed as the inexorable heart of an entire world. In the year 64 after Christ, while Roman legions guarded the most distant frontiers and merchants sailed across the inland seas, carrying spices, silks, and slaves, the capital of the Roman Empire rose monumental, colossal, and teeming, an impressive amalgamation of imperial opulence and popular misery. Between the historic hills and valleys filled with winding alleys, resplendent palaces stood tall, temples consecrated to the eternal gods, forums filled with voices, and squares where the fate of the Republic, now extinct, had been sealed. Rome was at the same time a marvel of engineering and a labyrinth of human fragility. The aqueducts that crossed the skies over stone arches ensured clean water to public fountains and the wealthiest homes, while the insulae, tall and precarious buildings where most of the population lived, crowded dangerously over narrow, suffocating streets, impregnated by the smell of smoke, sweat, and fermentation. More than 1 million inhabitants breathed the same dense air, and every corner, every market, and every tavern was a stage for encounters, intrigues, and survival, a vibrant and disorderly daily life, always on the brink of chaos. Atop the Palatine, the domus of senators and patricians dazzled with their mosaics, gardens, and murmuring fountains, sheltered from the tumult of the plebeians. The Roman Forum, the political and economic center, bustled with magistrates, lawyers, vendors, and onlookers, all under the shadow of Corinthian columns and triumphal arches that immortalized military conquests. And alongside the splendor of public works, like the Pantheon and the thermal baths, claustrophobic alleys persisted, where wood and straw formed a combination as flammable as it was inevitable, always evoking the dreaded specter of devastating fires. By then, the city had already experienced the flames of destruction in other times, but none had ever shaken its structure and pride like the one that silently approached. Yet, before the fire, Rome exuded the confidence of a civilization that believed itself invincible, supported by undefeated legions by the Pax Romana and by the law that had codified the known world. Between squares and sanctuaries, between forums and taverns, the city vibrated with the races at the Circus Maximus, the tragedies performed in theaters, and the rumors of palace conspiracies that made even the very foundations of the Palatine tremble. The capital of the world neither slept nor stopped. At night, under the flickering glow of torches and oil lamps, the popular neighborhoods filled with voices, songs, and dangers hidden in the shadows. Guards patrolled the main roads, but many knew that true power resided not only in the Senate or the Praetorian Guard, but in the anonymity of the crowds and the uncontrollable vastness of the metropolis. Rome was a living organism, whose lungs were the markets, its stomach the taverns, and its intestines the sewers winding beneath the worn stones of its streets. On the imperial throne, Nero, young and eccentric, wielded supreme power, while rumors about his penchant for the arts and his aversion to administrative duties already elicited cynical smiles and wary glances among the most seasoned politicians. Yet few could imagine that soon the very city that symbolized absolute power would be consumed by flames, and that its ruler would be eternally associated with this tragedy. At that moment, Rome was the absolute center of the world, magnificent and vulnerable, splendid and fragile, ready to be immortalized by history, not only for its glories, but also for its smoldering ruins. Nero Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus. The name resonated through the corridors of the Palatine and the squares of Rome as that of an emperor whose figure transcended the boundaries of conventional power and projected itself with equal intensity into the realms of art, extravagance, and scandal. Son of Agrippina the Younger, great-granddaughter of Augustus and sister of Caligula, Nero was not born destined for the throne. His ascent was the result of an intricate web of alliances, intrigues, and assassinations, carefully orchestrated by his mother, whose ambition and cunning shaped the young man's path to the supreme power of the empire. When, at 17, Nero assumed the throne, the Roman world found itself before a sovereign as young as he was inexperienced, yet surrounded by a shrewd political entourage composed of the philosopher Seneca, his tutor, and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. Under their guidance, the first years of his rule seemed to herald an era of justice, clemency, and stability. But the veil of balance soon unraveled revealing the complex and contradictory essence of Nero, a man who, more than ruling, longed to be adored, not as an emperor, but as an artist. Nero nurtured a visceral love for the performing arts, especially singing, poetry, and theatre. It was not enough for him that poets sang his glory, or that sculptors immortalized his image in marble. Nero wanted to be the poet, the singer, and the actor himself. He dressed in the tunics of Greek tragedians, wielded the lyre with the dexterity of a consummate musician, and performed long and impassioned monologues, whether before intimate audiences at court or in public spectacles that scandalized the most traditional sectors of the Roman elite, for whom such displays were unworthy of a princeps. This artistic passion, however, was not mere whim or frivolity. Rather, it was the expression of a personality seeking to break free from the rigid imperial protocol, affirming itself as a creator, a superior being whose artistic genius would justify any political or moral transgression. For Nero, governing and creating were two sides of the same coin, and his pursuit of aesthetic glory gradually became a dangerous path marked by the alienation of the aristocracy and discredit among senatorial circles. As his need for artistic approval grew, so too did his paranoia and intolerance of criticism. Family relations deteriorated irreparably. His mother, Agrippina, was murdered on his orders, a crime that shook Rome and, according to some, marked the moment when Nero abandoned any trace of the moderate governance of his early years. His wife, Octavia, was repudiated and executed on false charges, while his new lover, Poppaea Sabina, reigned sovereign over the emperor's heart and the corridors of power. Politically, Nero increasingly distanced himself from administrative duties, delegating governance to favorites and ministers, while focusing more and more on his artistic performances, travels, and megalomaniacal projects, such as the construction of the Domus Aurea, the palace that would later be seen as the ultimate symbol of his supposed madness and his insensitivity in the face of public tragedies. Yet despite his eccentricities and cruelties, Nero managed to cultivate an ambiguous relationship with the Roman people. He promoted grand spectacles at the Circus Maximus, distributed food during times of scarcity, and organized memorable festivities, ensuring a popularity that for a long time protected him from downfall. His image among the masses contrasted with the aversion he inspired in the Senate and the most traditional members of the elite, for whom Nero represented not only the moral degeneration of the empire, but also the collapse of the republican values that still lingered in the collective memory. Thus, on the eve of the great fire that would forever mark his existence, Nero was an emperor in full metamorphosis. From promising youth to misunderstood artist, from ruler to tyrant, from man to tragic myth. His name was already entangled with legends and rumors, and his fate, intertwined with that of the city that had crowned him sovereign, was about to be sealed by the flames that would consume Rome and forever immortalize the question, was Nero the incendiary of Rome, or merely its most illustrious victim? The night of July 18th to 19th, in the year 64 after Christ, began like so many others under the warm sky of the Roman summer, with hot winds winding through the narrow alleys of the Subura and the corridors of the Circus Maximus, where wooden stalls, canvas tents, and flammable warehouses created a setting ripe for disaster. In Rome at that time, there was no organized fire brigade, nor effective regulations to prevent the overcrowding of fragile and combustible structures that lined the most populous neighborhoods of the city. The risk of fire was constant, but that night would be different, extraordinary, apocalyptic. According to the accounts of Tacitus, it was precisely in one of the shops located near the Circus Maximus that the fire began, like a hungry tongue of flame that quickly spread, driven by the wind and fed by the wooden structures dried out by the summer heat. The fire, initially contained within a part of the market, soon escaped control, spreading violently in various directions. Within hours, the flames reached not only the commercial tents but also nearby homes, climbing hills, leaping over alleys, crossing courtyards, and consuming one by one the adjacent neighborhoods. The screams of the first victims mixed with the crackling of burning wood, the groaning of collapsing structures, and the desperate trampling of entire families trying in vain to save their belongings and escape the flames. The narrow, winding, and crowded streets quickly turned into fatal traps, where many were suffocated by smoke or crushed under the rubble of collapsing buildings. As the night progressed, the reddish glow of the flames tinged the sky, reflecting in the waters of the Tiber and visible from distant hills such as the Janiculum and the Quirinal. Panic quickly spread throughout the city. The merciless fire spared neither temples, monuments, nor noble houses. Everything was reduced to ashes with the same indifference. Not even the Palatine, symbol of imperial power, was spared from the threat. While the wealthiest fled to their villas on the outskirts, carrying jewels and provisions, the poor were once again abandoned to their own fate, trapped in the dead-end alleys where the fire consumed even hope itself. Efforts to fight the fire proved insufficient and disorganized. The authorities, caught by surprise, had no plans or resources to confront a disaster of such magnitude. Groups of residents, improvised as brigades, fought with buckets of water drawn from public fountains and private wells. But the fire advanced faster than they could contain it. Many, resigned, simply fled, while others looted abandoned homes in an explosion of chaos and violence that only intensified the catastrophe. At the epicenter of the disaster, rumors began to spread like invisible flames. Some said that men had been seen deliberately setting fires at certain points, preventing the blaze from being contained. Others claimed that hidden forces, perhaps at the command of the emperor himself, had an interest in seeing Rome destroyed. Disinformation, as always in times of calamity, was a fuel as potent as the wood and straw of the burning homes. As the night seemed endless, with the sky ablaze and the city on the brink of collapse, a question began to form, silent and terrible, in the hearts of survivors and within the collective memory that, centuries later, would still attempt to decipher the events of that dawn. Was the fire an accident, a divine act, or the perverse manifestation of a human will? Thus began what would be remembered as the Great Fire of Rome, an unprecedented tragedy that in a few days would transform the capital of the world into a sea of smoldering ruins and give rise to one of the most persistent and controversial accusations in history, that Nero, the artist emperor, had ordered the destruction of his own city. The fire that had timidly ignited in the heart of the circus, Maximus quickly transformed into an indomitable monster that devoured Rome with relentless fury over 6 long and terrifying nights. During this period, the city, which for centuries had seemed invulnerable, found itself reduced to a heap of rubble, embers, and laments, while the flames danced under a crimson sky, dyed by smoke and despair. The winds, involuntary accomplices of the tragedy, propelled the fire from neighborhood to neighborhood, as if they were ancient gods, enraged by human arrogance, blowing destruction over a metropolis that, until then, had never known such a vast calamity. Of the 14 districts that comprised the city, 3 were completely destroyed, while 7 others suffered severe and irreparable damage. The poorest areas, made up of overcrowded insulae, were the first to succumb, their fragile wooden buildings collapsing under the scorching heat. The nights, once filled with the murmur of taverns and the echo of carts along the stone streets, became an incessant hell. Men, women, and children fled in all directions, carrying what they could: small chests of coins, statuettes of household gods, cloaks, or simply their own lives. The Via Sacra, Appia, and Flaminia, once conduits for legions and triumphal processions, were now overwhelmed by panicked crowds, moving beneath the glare of the flames that advanced with astonishing speed, leaping over rooftops, invading courtyards, and corroding foundations. The fire did not distinguish the profane from the sacred. Temples venerated for centuries, such as those of Jupiter Stator and Vesta, succumbed to the flames, while forums, triumphal arches, and basilicas collapsed under the unbearable heat. Even the most robust monuments erected in stone gave way, their columns cracked, their pediments fallen, their interiors transformed into caves of charcoal and ash. Accounts tell that, confronted with the magnitude of the destruction, many Romans watched in silence as their city was reduced to ruins. Others wept, and some, desperate, threw themselves into the flames, preferring immediate death to the slow agony caused by collapsing buildings or suffocation from the thick smoke that hovered over Rome like a mournful shroud. Amid the chaos, there was no shortage of brutality and selfishness. Looting was carried out by groups who, protected by the disorder, invaded abandoned houses and took with them jewelry, provisions, and works of art. while patricians attempted, through bribes and armed escorts, to ensure the rescue of their belongings and their families. Solidarity gave way to the instinct for survival, and Rome, which had so often celebrated its superior civilization, now found itself reduced to its rawest and most animalistic essence. During those days of relentless fire, legions stationed near the city tried to assist in fighting the flames, but their efforts proved futile. There were no organized fire brigades as in modern times, nor water pumps or protective equipment. Efforts consisted of creating demolition barriers, destroying houses and blocking streets to contain the fire's advance. But often these measures only deepened the population's despair as they saw their homes destroyed preemptively, with no guarantee of salvation. Meanwhile, the Tiber, which had so often served as a means of transport and a source of life for the city, now became an escape route. Improvised boats ferried entire families to the opposite banks, and thousands of Romans crowded in the fields of the Vatican and the more distant hills, watching in terror the macabre spectacle of their homeland's destruction, with the fire painting the horizon and the air thick with soot, ash, and tears. 6 days and 7 nights passed under the dominion of the flames, until, exhausted by its own fury, the fire began to wane, defeated not by men, but by the depletion of its own fuel. The city had been consumed. When at last the last flames died out and the smoke began to clear, what remained was a desolate panorama, entire neighborhoods transformed into deserts of ruins, charred bodies among smoldering rubble, historic monuments pulverized, and a population paralyzed by grief and bewilderment. In that scene of devastation, Rome seemed for the first time in centuries mortal. The capital that had withstood invaders, conspiracies, and internal rebellions now lay vanquished by an invisible, merciless, and perhaps human enemy: fire. And like a specter hovering over the ruins, a question began to spread, shaping the collective imagination for millennia to come. Who was responsible for such a cataclysm? Chance, divine wrath, or the emperor himself? As Rome burned, consumed by flames that seemed never to extinguish, Emperor Nero, supreme ruler of the vastest and most powerful empire of antiquity, became, whether involuntarily or not, the silent protagonist of one of history's most controversial episodes. The question that has reverberated ever since, echoing through the corridors of historiography and across the stages of popular culture, is this: where was Nero when Rome burned? And more than that, what was he doing as the flames destroyed the very city that embodied the power and glory of his reign? The accounts of ancient sources, especially those of Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, are marked by ambiguities, rumors, and possibly political and moral prejudices. Some claim that Nero was in the port city of Antium, his birthplace about 60 kilometers from Rome, when he received the news of the fire. Others maintain that he was in Rome, watching impassively, or worse, ecstatically contemplating the flames that devoured the metropolis. The most infamous episode, immortalized especially by popular tradition, is that of Nero standing atop his imperial residence, playing the lyre and singing verses about the destruction of Troy while his own city was consumed by fire. This evocative and dramatic image has been indelibly etched into the Western imagination. The artist emperor, detached from the people's suffering, surrendering to the aesthetics of disaster, indifferent to the real tragedy. However, such an image is likely more a literary construction than a factual record. According to Tacitus, considered one of the most reliable sources, Nero, upon learning of the fire, hurried back to Rome and, once in the city, did not remain idle. On the contrary, he is said to have personally organized relief and shelter operations for the victims, opening his own gardens and palaces, such as those of the Campus Martius and the Palatine, to house the displaced. Moreover, he ordered the distribution of supplies such as grain and clothing, in an attempt to alleviate the population's suffering and to restore, at least partially, public order. These actions, however, did not prevent rumors from circulating insidiously and devastatingly. The sheer magnitude of the tragedy, combined with the emperor's eccentric and unpopular personality among the aristocracy and senate, fueled suspicions that Nero might not only have failed to prevent the fire, but worse, had deliberately provoked it. The alleged motive, according to such rumors, was the desire to rebuild Rome according to his own designs, transforming the old and chaotic city into a monumental metropolis with wide avenues, new buildings, and above all, sufficient space to erect his most ambitious creation, the Domus Aurea, the Golden Palace. Chroniclers are divided. Some suggest that the speed and scale of the architectural projects following the fire are proof of premeditation, while others argue that such initiatives were simply a necessary response to the city's near-total destruction. The fact remains that, since those fiery days, Nero has been simultaneously seen as both the possible arsonist and the benefactor who aided his people amidst the calamity. While the city still smoldered, the emperor personally walked through the ruins, perhaps seeking artistic inspiration, perhaps assessing the damage and directing reconstruction efforts. According to some sources, he wept upon seeing the destroyed temples and neighborhoods reduced to ashes. According to others, he contemplated it coldly, already envisioning the new Rome that would rise from the ruins of the old. At the center of this tangle of contradictory accounts emerges the complex figure of Nero, a man obsessed with art and glory, capable of public acts of generosity but also of cruelty, a ruler who simultaneously loved and feared his people, an emperor who, for some, was a victim of slander and for others, the very symbol of self-destructive despotism. Thus, while the embers still burned beneath Rome's ancient stones, the image of Nero, whether as savior or as arsonist, was already beginning to fix itself into the fabric of historical memory, destined to inflame, for centuries and millennia, the debates over his true responsibility in the greatest urban tragedy of antiquity. When the last flames were extinguished and Rome emerged from its Calvary as a mutilated city, covered in ash and buried silences, a human and political necessity imposed itself with the inevitable force of destiny to find a culprit. The fire could not simply be the product of chance or negligence. Its scale and ferocity demanded an explanation, and for many, the figure of Nero seemed to fit sinisterly into that burning void left by the flames. Amid the smoldering ruins and the displaced multitudes wandering through the rubble, rumors gained strength, like hidden embers beneath the ash. It was said that the emperor, eager for space to realize his architectural fantasies, had ordered the city he ruled to be set ablaze. The coincidence between the destruction and the subsequent commencement of construction on his colossal Domus Aurea reinforced for many the idea that the tragedy had been premeditated, a deliberate act of arrogance and inhumanity. Tacitus, in his relentless chronicle, observes that although it cannot be stated with certainty that Nero ordered the fire, it also cannot be ignored that the suspicions were fueled by the emperor's own conduct. His passion for reconstruction, his disdain for Rome's traditional architecture, his desire to leave an indelible artistic mark on the city, all seem to converge toward the view of the fire not as an accident, but as a work, albeit a criminal one, of his will. Aware of the danger these accusations posed to his image and authority, Nero reacted with strategic coldness. He quickly sought a scapegoat to divert the fury and popular hatred away from himself. The choice fell upon a small, marginalized, and widely misunderstood group, the Christians. Still an obscure sect within the religious mosaic of Rome, the followers of Christ were viewed with distrust and repulsion by most of the population. Their refusal to participate in traditional cults, their rejection of worshipping the state gods, and their practice of private rites, shrouded in mystery, fed the worst prejudices. To many Romans, Christians were atheists, subversives, and potentially dangerous. Thus, nothing was more convenient than attributing to them the responsibility for the fire. Nero ordered a relentless persecution. Christians were arrested en masse, many interrogated under torture, to extract confessions of the supposed crime and to denounce other members of the community. Executions followed with calculated cruelty, designed to satisfy both the popular desire for vengeance and the emperor's need to reaffirm his authority. In spectacles organized in the gardens of the Palatine, Christians were crucified, wrapped in animal skins and thrown to beasts, or even more macabre, tied to stakes and set alight at nightfall, transformed into human torches that illuminated the emperor's banquets. The sight of these atrocious deaths was recorded with horror by Tacitus, who, despite his antipathy toward Christians, did not fail to condemn the brutality of the punishments. These events marked the beginning of Christian martyrdom in Rome, transforming the persecuted into symbols of spiritual resistance and later into saints venerated by millions. The blood spilled in Nero's gardens nourished the roots of a faith that, centuries later, would become the dominant religion of the very empire that now persecuted them. But beyond the tragedy of the victims, the accusation against the Christians served primarily as a smokescreen to shield Nero. For a time, it succeeded in placating popular unrest and deflecting the gravest suspicions. Yet the gesture revealed more than a political tactic. It demonstrated the extent to which the emperor was willing to manipulate fear and prejudice to preserve his power. Thus, the blame for the fire was efficiently transferred to the Christians, while Nero proceeded with his plans of reconstruction and magnificence. However, the doubt, a seed cast among the ashes, would never be extinguished. To this day, it remains incandescent in humanity's memory. Was the true arsonist of Rome the emperor, chance, or the very historical necessity of transformation? From the ashes, Rome rose once again, as it had so many times throughout its history, but this time not merely as a city rebuilt, but as a radically new vision shaped by the iron will and grand imagination of a single man, Nero. The emperor, whom so many accused of having ignited the fire, now presented himself as the architect of urban resurrection, promoting a reform that would forever alter the profile of the empire's capital, and with it, the very foundations of Roman urbanism. The reconstruction of Rome after the fire was not a mere replacement of lost structures, but an ambitious project imbued with an aesthetic and functional vision revolutionary for its time. It was decreed that new buildings be erected in stone or other fire-resistant materials, abandoning whenever possible the wood and construction techniques that had proven so vulnerable. The streets, once narrow, winding and conducive to the spread of fires, were widened, straightened, and reoriented according to a more rational logic, allowing greater air circulation and reducing the risks of future tragedies. It was in this context that the emperor began the realization of his most famous and controversial work, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, built over a vast expanse of land that before the fire had been occupied by entire neighborhoods and by Rome's aristocracy. The Domus Aurea was not merely a palace, but a colossal architectural complex, including gardens, artificial lakes, monumental porticos, and halls adorned with rare marbles and exuberant paintings. The grandeur of the project shocked the Roman elite. Many saw in that construction the confirmation of their worst suspicions, that the fire had indeed been provoked to make room for the emperor's megalomaniacal delusion. The extent of the palace, said to occupy an area of more than 50 hectares, seemed an insult to the thousands of citizens who had lost their homes and lives in the recent tragedy. Yet for Nero and his supporters, the Domus Aurea was more than a symbol of power. It was the materialization of a new conception of Rome, no longer a city of chaotic clusters, but a metropolis worthy of imperial splendor. The palace was adorned with bold architectural innovations, such as the celebrated octagonal revolving room, which slowly turned to follow the course of the sun and was covered in gold, precious stones, and stuccos that reflected light as if the palace itself were a terrestrial star. At the same time, Nero did not fail to promote measures that, at least in appearance, benefited the population. Urban regulations were implemented, establishing standards for the height of new constructions and creating systems for fire protection. Public squares and safety corridors between buildings were opened, while new aqueducts and water reservoirs were planned to ensure supplies in case of emergency. Thus, Nero's new Rome was born under the sign of duality. On the one hand, it represented an unprecedented architectural and urbanistic advancement. On the other, it became a living monument to imperial ego, raising ethical and political questions that would traverse the centuries. Many Romans began to consider the city not as their common homeland, but as the private stage of one man's will. And so, from the ruins of the ancient urban fabric, there arose a transformed Rome, more ordered, more monumental, but also perhaps colder and less organic, like a grand theater in which the emperor himself incessantly played his favorite role, that of absolute creator. The clean and aligned stones, the reconstructed forums, the new arches and broad avenues, all seem to proclaim not only the overcoming of disaster, but the almost desperate attempt to rewrite the memory of the tragedy, erasing, along with the rubble, the suspicions that hovered over Nero. Yet not even the brightest marble columns could obliterate the invisible scars left by the fire, nor silence the voices that, low and obstinate, continued to ask, and if, behind all this beauty, lay the guilty hand of the very restorer. Thus, Nero's new Rome became at once a work of reconstruction and a monument to doubt, an ambivalent legacy that, like so many other human creations, intertwined progress and tragedy, art and destruction, redemption and guilt. As the stones of the new Rome settled, and the ashes slowly began to give way to gleaming marbles and geometric gardens, Nero, conscious of the invisible power of image and narrative, undertook a meticulous and sophisticated campaign of imperial propaganda. More than rebuilding the devastated city, it was necessary to rebuild trust, loyalty, and, above all, the Roman people's memory of their emperor. In an empire that, although vast and powerful, still lacked modern instruments of mass communication, propaganda was carried out through other, equally effective means: monuments, coins, spectacles, and architecture itself. Each column erected, each avenue widened, each restored aqueduct became a silent yet eloquent testimony to the emperor's generosity and competence. Thus, Nero appeared depicted on coins minted after the fire as the Retur Restitutor Urbis, the restorer of the city, with a laurel-crowned head, a symbol of victory not over foreign enemies, but over chaos and internal destruction. Moreover, the propaganda unfolded through a sequence of grand public spectacles. Games, chariot races, and festivals of music and poetry were organized not only to entertain the exhausted population, but also to reinforce the image of the emperor as a patron of the arts, a friend of the people, and a defender of Romanitas, the essence of Roman civilization. Nero, more than any emperor before him, understood the political power of spectacle. Thus, when he ascended the improvised stages, dressed as a Greek tragedian, singing songs or reciting poems, he did so not only as an artist but as a sovereign, defining his authority not through sword or decree, but through aesthetic admiration and shared emotion. This political performance, however, elicited ambivalent reactions. While the lower classes largely viewed with enthusiasm and sympathy the emperor who mingled with artists and offered colossal festivities, the aristocracy and the Senate regarded such attitudes as an affront to imperial dignity and Roman tradition. In the visual arts and architecture, the same principle guided his actions. The monumental Domus Aurea was not merely a private palace, but an aesthetic affirmation of power. The idyllic landscape paintings, the vaults adorned with gold and precious stones, the halls where natural light penetrated in calculated ways, all conveyed the idea of an emperor who transcended mere political administration and positioned himself as a demiurge, a creator who shaped not only the city, but the very sensory experience of those who inhabited it. Yet behind this careful construction of image, resentment and suspicion remained latent. Imperial propaganda, however efficient, could not completely erase the rumors that the fire had been Nero's own doing. Worse, for many, the ostentation of the new works, especially the Domus Aurea, became a provocation, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had deprived thousands of Romans of their homes so the emperor could erect his golden palace. The writers of the time and posterity, especially senatorial historians like Tacitus and Suetonius, reinforced this perception, delineating the portrait of an egotistical, insensitive, and aesthetically obsessed emperor who cared more about the grandeur of his works and the perfection of his performances than the actual well-being of his subjects. Thus, even gestures of generosity and urban reforms ended up being read by many as cynical attempts at self-promotion and symbolic manipulation. Yet it must be considered that Nero also knew how to cultivate a solid popular base. For the humbler strata, who rarely had a voice in official historiography, the emperor who organized festivities, distributed food, and created new infrastructures could very well be seen as a benefactor. The tension between these different perceptions of Nero, the aesthetic despot or the emperor of the people, remains, even today, one of the most fascinating aspects of his historical figure. Thus, as Rome physically reassembled itself, its memory and political narrative were skillfully shaped by imperial propaganda. But, like hidden embers that resist time and wind, the suspicions did not extinguish, preparing the ground for the episodes that, a few years later, would mark Nero's tragic downfall and the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. The fire of Rome, more than an urban catastrophe or a humanitarian tragedy, has been cemented in history as a watershed that profoundly and multifacetedly redefined the political, religious, and cultural trajectories not only of the empire's capital, but of all Roman civilization. Its legacy was not limited to the charred ruins or the widened avenues. It extended, like an invisible scar, over the collective imagination, over power relations, and above all, over the beliefs that would shape the soul of the West. Politically, the fire consolidated a new paradigm in the relationship between the emperor and the city. The figure of Nero, who until then oscillated between popular admiration and aristocratic disdain, became definitively associated with an idea of personalist, aestheticized, and, for many, irresponsible power. The reconstruction of Rome, though technically advanced and visionary, was interpreted as the imposition of imperial will over tradition, a gesture of arrogance that sacrificed the memory of the old city in favor of the vanity of a single man. At the same time, the fire accentuated the tensions already existing between the central power and the senatorial and aristocratic sectors. The urban remodeling and the construction of the Domus Aurea were seen as clear symbols of the centralization of power in the emperor's hands, further eroding the remnants of the Republic and transforming Rome from a city of citizens into a stage under the absolute dominion of the princeps. From this episode onward, the image of the emperor as the sole architect of Rome's destiny became even more pronounced, paving the way for increasingly autocratic forms of government. In the religious sphere, the impact was equally profound and enduring. The persecution of Christians, unleashed as a response to the fire, marked the first major episode of systematic repression against this emerging community. The martyrdom of countless Christians, many of whom would later be canonized, transformed Roman soil into a sacred field of testimony and suffering, giving rise to a tradition of spiritual resistance that would fuel the growth and consolidation of Christianity in the centuries to come. This episode also exposed the vulnerability of religious minorities within the empire and the imperial power's willingness to manipulate them as instruments of social and political control. The persecution of Christians in Rome under Nero inaugurated a cycle of violence and intolerance that would be repeated in varying degrees and intensities until Constantine's conversion more than 2 centuries later. Thus, the fire, rather than extinguishing this new faith, ultimately strengthened it, providing it with martyrs, myths, and a narrative of triumph over oppression. Culturally, the fire and the subsequent reconstruction forever altered the aesthetic and urban organization of Rome. The conception of wider streets, fire-resistant buildings, and better distributed public spaces were concrete legacies that influenced urban planning throughout the empire, serving as a model for other cities and provinces. The Domus Aurea, with its architectural and decorative audacity, though later repudiated and partly destroyed after Nero's death, exerted a lasting influence on Roman art and architecture, anticipating styles and techniques that would be perfected in subsequent centuries. On the symbolic level, the fire crystallized as a metaphor for the fragility of human order before chaos, the transience of glory, and the inevitability of ruin, themes that would later be revisited by poets, historians, and artists as lessons about the nature of power and civilization. The image of Rome consumed by flames came to inhabit the collective unconscious, sometimes as a warning against the excesses of ambition, sometimes as a symbol of the eternal rebirth of the city, always capable of rising, more beautiful and stronger from its own ashes. Nero's name, in turn, was never dissociated from the fire. For many, he was the arsonist, the tyrant who sacrificed his city to vanity. For others, an unjustly accused ruler, a victim of circumstances and of a hostile historiographical tradition. The fact is that the episode defined his reputation forever, transforming him into one of the most ambiguous and fascinating historical archetypes, at once artist and criminal, creator and destroyer, martyr of the very legend that suffocated him. Thus, the legacy of the fire transcended the physical event to become a civilizational occurrence, whose reverberations shaped the politics, religion, and culture of Rome and the Roman world. Even today, as we contemplate the ruins of the empire or evoke the name of Nero, it is not only the fire that we recall, but the profound and lasting consequences it provoked in a city and in a humanity always divided between the desire to build and the inevitable impulse to destroy. The fire of Rome, transcended into memory, was transformed into myth, and with it the figure of Nero ceased to belong solely to the domain of history and entered the ambiguous pantheon of characters whose essence is continually reinterpreted according to the temperaments, ideologies, and sensibilities of each era. From the earliest chronicles to the most recent expressions of popular culture, the judgment of Nero has oscillated between inflexible condemnation and humanized re-evaluation, sketching a portrait where the lines of guilt and innocence, madness and genius, barbarism and civilization are indissolubly intertwined. The historians of antiquity, such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, bequeathed to us the accounts that laid the foundations of the traditional version of imperial guilt. Nero as the arsonist, the depraved artist who, insensitive to the suffering of his people, transformed an urban tragedy into an aesthetic spectacle, playing his lyre while the city burned. This powerful and cinematic image became so deeply anchored in the collective imagination that it resisted contestation for centuries, perpetuating itself as a symbol of the ruler who, given to the excesses of vanity and absolute power, is capable of sacrificing his own homeland to satisfy his whims. However, the very foundations of this narrative are today the subject of growing historiographical revision. Many contemporary scholars point to the ambiguities, contradictions, and political interests present in the ancient sources, recognizing in them not merely historical accounts, but also discourses shaped by the circumstances and resentments of the senatorial elite, who saw in Nero a tyrant and destroyer of republican traditions. Modern archaeologists and historians emphasize that large-scale fires were relatively common events in Rome, given the precarious urban conditions and the dry Mediterranean summer climate. The magnitude of the disaster in 64 after Christ, though exceptional, may have resulted from a combination of natural and human factors rather than an imperial conspiracy. Moreover, the measures undertaken by Nero to assist the victims and rebuild the city indicate for some not the calculated coldness of the guilty, but the pragmatic action of a ruler facing a calamity. Thus, Nero's figure begins to be contemplated under a more complex light, not merely as the incendiary monster of tradition, but as a singular emperor, deeply marked by his passion for the arts, his pursuit of innovation, and his rupture with the norms of his time. The Domus Aurea, once a symbol of megalomaniacal madness, is now recognized as a masterpiece of Roman architecture, anticipating aesthetic solutions that decisively influenced later developments. In popular culture, however, the archetypal image of Nero persists. He continues to be portrayed as the madman who played while Rome burned, as the villain who consummated the empire's greatest tragedy. Cinema, literature, and the visual arts have perpetuated this vision, which, due to its symbolic power, surpasses the nuances of historical critique. The scene of the emperor singing while the fire devours his city has become a universal metaphor for the folly and cruelty of power, evoked in different contexts whenever there is a desire to denounce the ruler who, indifferent to destruction, revels in the spectacle of his own glory. And yet, there are also those who see in Nero's trajectory the tragic portrait of the misunderstood artist, whose sensitivity and aspiration to beauty violently collided with the brutal demands of political power and the expectations of a profoundly conservative society. His life, then, could be read not as a drama of pure villainy, but as a Greek tragedy in which hybris, excess, inevitably led to downfall. Thus, between myth and history, between condemnation and rehabilitation, Nero continues to inhabit the human imagination as an insoluble enigma, a flame that never extinguishes, eternally oscillating between creative light and destructive fire. The judgment of Nero, initiated under the reddened skies of burning Rome, remains open, reflecting not only the facts of a distant time, but the questions and dilemmas that even today haunt the relationship between power, responsibility, and memory. From the ashes cooled beneath the weight of time and the ruins that once rose as silent witnesses to destruction, Rome was reborn, not for the first time, nor for the last. For Rome, more than stone and mortar, is a principle, an indomitable idea that, like the phoenix of mythology, consumes itself in fire only to, from its own heat, forge itself stronger, more beautiful, more eternal. The fire of 64 after Christ, which seemed, to the eyes of those who lived through it, the end of the world, was in truth merely another metamorphosis in a long and continuous sequence of rebirths. The city that the flame devoured did not disappear. It was transformed. The inflamed wood gave way to solid stone, the labyrinthine alleys to ordered avenues, the stacked neighborhoods to squares open to air and light. Rome rose from its ruin with the dignity of one who knows the precariousness of all human things, but also with the certainty of its own permanence. And under the clear skies that succeeded the smoke, new forums were built, new temples were consecrated, and new emperors paraded with their legions through the triumphal arches. Time carried on, indifferent to past pain, yet attentive to the lesson inscribed in the stones, that all glory is transient and all ruin a potential for rebirth. Beyond material reconstruction, the fire bequeathed to Rome and to the world a narrative about the fragility of human order and the resilience of cultures that know how to reinvent themselves. The flames that consumed homes, monuments, and lives also incinerated old certainties, making room for new conceptions of city, of power, and of memory. And thus, Rome perpetuated itself not merely as the capital of an empire, but as the supreme symbol of the human capacity to begin again. Therefore, when walking today among the ruins of the Forum, when contemplating the vestiges of the baths and aqueducts, when touching the broken columns that witness the fury of the flames and the patience of reconstruction, one should see not only decay, but also the silent victory of permanence over destruction. Rome burned, yes, but Rome did not extinguish. It will never extinguish. For as long as there is memory, as long as there is a voice to evoke its name, as long as there is stone upon stone, or even the mere remembrance of them, Rome will be eternal. Thus ends this narrative, as Rome never ends, always being reborn under new forms, new empires, new fires, and new rebirths. For Rome is not, never was, and never will be merely a place. Rome is a time that refuses to pass.